Johns Hopkins study for national priorities to combat misinformation and disinformation for COVID-19 and future public health threats, a call for national strategy. This came out in March 2021, pretty recently. I found that while I was looking at the Johns Hopkins website. And I want to make it a habit to precede each one of these with that William Blum quote. And I'm just going to keep on saying it because I think it's true and it helps provide some context, because a lot of this stuff is tough to swallow. Remember, William Blum is he was a former State Department employee turned journalist who's explored a lot of things like government corruption and made some important discoveries. He said that no matter how paranoid or conspiracy-minded you are, what the government is actually doing is worse than you can imagine. Now, this is, when they're talking about combating misinformation and disinformation, they're talking about combating information that refutes their narrative. You have to keep in mind that propaganda was legalized during the Obama administration. We also have, kind of in partnership with that, the Bush administration having made it legal to spy on its own citizens through the Patriot Act. And surveillance factors into this as well. This is a super Orwellian document. It is a... All right, so I'll just start here from the top, going through this, reading certain segments and offering a little bit of feedback on those. Setbacks in the COVID-19 response have highlighted that health-related misinformation or disinformation can lead to more infections, deaths, disruption, and disorganization to the effort. Okay, so this is their premise for criminalizing dissenters. They establish a danger there that needs to be intervened against, because this misinformation, these messages that they don't bless, cause infections, death, and disruption. Which, now, considering that this is a well-researched document, there are 101 endnotes here. You'd think that they'd provide data for statements like that. They say things later in here about how people sharing information that the CDC doesn't put, or the WHO doesn't put out first, can lead to deaths and has led to deaths. You'd think that they'd be able to substantiate that with some kind of data points, with something that's apparently so heavily researched by apparent experts. Disinformation can lead to, let me read the next sentence first. The public health response and communication environment in the United States have been disrupted by significant distrust in government. That's a problem. They need you to trust the government. Taken together, the spread and consequence of public health misinformation and disinformation can lead to a range of outcomes that have national security implications and require effective response. So unprogrammed beliefs are a matter of national security now. It's a national security issue, really, to just ask questions. Unfortunately, there are no easy solutions to the problem of health-related misinformation. No U.S. agency is tasked with leading a unified response. Constitutional concerns with free speech limit some potential interventions, and solutions require cooperation across a range of stakeholders. It is time for the United States to address the problem of health misinformation through a national strategy. So they're saying there's constitutional concerns with free speech that limit some potential interventions. So those pesky freedoms really need to be clamped down on. The National Security Council should be responsible for developing and overseeing U.S. strategy for preventing and responding to health-related misinformation and disinformation. So I have to ask, how can there be misinformation and disinformation when this is supposed to be a novel coronavirus that we don't know much about? And they talk about information voids. That kind of conflicts with their narrative of misinformation or disinformation too, because for there to be misinformation, we have to have the reality, the true information nailed down pretty hard, which apparently we don't have. We know we don't have it, if in fact this is a novel experience that we're having. So anybody that is raising questions about the narrative that we're getting about COVID-19, about what to do about it, about how virulent it is, about safe practices as they pertain to how to navigate this pandemic. That is being put in the spotlight. That's being scrutinized. There is an urgent national security and public health need to ensure effective management of public health misinformation by increasing accessibility of correct information and reducing the reach of false information through a combination of efforts. Well, yeah, we already see this all over social media. Pillar 1. This is the executive summary, and they have it broken down into pillars. Pillar 1 is intervene against false and damaging content as well as the sources propagating it. Establish a national, nonpartisan commission that provides neutral, evidence-based guidance. Neutral, huh? Identification of sources of misleading information. We have to encourage active, transparent, nonpartisan intervention from social media and news media companies to identify and remove and control the spread of and curtail generators of false information. So we need to pay Facebook and Twitter to censor people. We need to provide training and resources to do this. Choose responsible sources of information. Those are sources that they say are responsible, that they designate for you. There's no room for your own determination of what sources are valid and what are not. You'll be told what to believe. This is under Pillar 3, which is increase the public's resilience to misinformation and disinformation. Improve resources for public verification of questionable content through the development of a robust fact-checking infrastructure with support, training, and guiding principles for fact-checking organizations. A robust fact-checking infrastructure, robust fact-checking like Snopes, a fat lady and a cat, telling you what is true and what's not true based on how they feel. And how they feel is how these controlling mechanisms to take control of information and how it's disseminated. That's what Snopes regurgitates, and PolitiFact and things like that. These fact-checking websites and fact-checking infrastructure like that built into social media, which we talk about later here, is, they say, one-sided, unbiased, nonpartisan. Could you get a bigger, steamier load of horse crap than that? Nobody aside from the far left believes that there's no bias. Under Pillar 4, which is ensure a whole-of-nation response through multi-sector and multi-agency collaboration, we have increased coordination across the range of government stakeholders and conduct a cross-governmental analysis of efforts and responsibilities for managing health-related misinformation and disinformation in order to streamline and organize efforts. Key U.S. agencies include the Department of Defense, Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as intelligence agencies such as the FBI, the NSA, and the CIA. They are involved in what we're allowed to hear and what social media tells us to believe. False information, intentional or not, has a myriad of side effects in the past year. The spread of these falsehoods has led to more infections and deaths. How many? I mean, with a statement like that, you should be able to quantify that somehow. Which deaths have resulted from the spread of falsehoods? There's got to be some kind of study. 101 endnotes, and we don't know specifically which deaths? Okay, well, moving on. Taken together, the spread and consequence of public health misinformation can lead to a range of outcomes that have national security implications. Wow. So the eco-terrorists are coming. The problem, health-related misinformation and disinformation are messages that contradict the best expert evidence available. So the expert evidence, that's the problem. And here's the big distinction between the two factions of people that will go along with narratives without winking and people who question them. It's divided between people who have an implicit trust in authoritative sources or governmental structures that have been imbued with a sense of expertise. Here's the problem with that. Best expert evidence, they say. Best expert evidence as determined by whom? There are two sides to a number of these hot button political issues. Case in point, let's talk about climate change. I know I go to that a lot because this is woven into all of these documents. You can't separate COVID and climate change. You might think, what do those two have to do with each other? Well, quite a lot, actually, as we progress through these documents. You wouldn't think so, but they do. Why? Because they're both invisible global threats that require global solutions. So they keep on resurfacing. So we'll talk about that. So a climate change expert that gets a lot of airtime, a lot of time on the news. Good example of that would be Greta Thunberg, a child, not a scientist, not a climatologist, a child who has been trained to act. She does a good job. She is a good actress, but not a climatologist. Contrast that with Dr. Judith Curry, who is a climatologist and has studied climate change for decades and has concluded that we're in a normal state of fluctuation. There are ups and downs with climate. We're in a slight warming trend, but climate change alarmism is a hoax. Have you ever heard of Judith Curry? No, I haven't. I had to look at it to know her name. To remind myself of what I was just talking about, because she's not that familiar to me. Greta Thunberg is. I don't have to remind myself who that is. Why? Because Greta gets all this time on TV. A climatologist does not. Greta Thunberg is what they call the best expert evidence available. So they're going to tell you what to listen to. And it's not going to be the best expert evidence objectively. It's going to be the best evidence that they want you to swallow. In February 2020, the World Health Organization characterized the overwhelming amount of COVID-19 information, both true and untrue, as an infodemic. They're inventing words now, which undermines public health measures and leads to unnecessary loss of life. All right, can't tell me again, what loss of life are you trying to refer to here? The oversaturation of information during the pandemic allowed for confusion and misinformation to be spread among the public, who may struggle to differentiate between what is true and false. Lack of coordination at the federal level, healthcare professionals speaking outside of their expertise, and delayed responses to misinformation through official communication channels also aided the spread of false information. So, healthcare professionals speaking outside of their expertise. I don't understand my notes that I wrote on that. But basically, again, they're going to determine what the expertise is. However, major efforts have been made since the WHO declared a COVID-19 infodemic. Oh, I read the wrong note that I made. Including the release of a research agenda for managing infodemics. So anyway, I don't need to expand on that anyway. The U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of State have increased efforts to combat foreign propaganda. So we've got the DOD, we've got the DOS, we've got the FBI, we've got the NSA, and the CIA all involved in information control. Anyone who's read 1984 should be concerned about this. Many current recommendations focus on education and inoculation against misinformation, more accountability on the part of social media platforms in identifying and controlling the misinformation messages, interagency and international cooperation in managing misinformation, and use of machine learning / artificial intelligence to help identify and flag misinformation and disinformation in real time. Hence why in my descriptions of these videos, I'm not putting anything like COVID or SPARS or any such thing, because they'll flag it and they'll remove it. Because these algorithms, this AI and this machine learning that they're developing is becoming increasingly sophisticated, and they're going to be able to catch that. They can already. It's already at that point. I don't think I get enough hits for that to be relevant, though. So trying to stay under the radar. They're probably going to have some voice recognition technology that's going to create a text script of what I'm saying and flag it that way. But whatever, I'll do what I can. In response to misinformation and disinformation that has spread via traditional news media, private groups have begun efforts to deter advertising with news organizations that are perpetuating misinformation. And they're not talking about the mainstream media. The mainstream media is getting their propaganda narrative out there. Policy recommendations and legislative bills have been developed in an attempt to fight misinformation and disinformation. So we're probably going to have some legislation coming our way that's going to enhance their agenda here. Facebook has also created the Oversight Board to review content removal. The WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger misinformation policies center on preventing the spread of viral messages by limiting the number of times a message can be forwarded. Google-owned YouTube's medical misinformation strategy does not allow information contradictory to that of local health authorities or the WHO. Again, Hermann Göring, this is Third Reich propaganda tactics here. In one of the earliest efforts to combat false information about vaccines, Pinterest began limiting and breaking the search function for vaccine-related information on the platform. Now, whether or not you are in agreement with this vaccination protocol, this should still be alarming. It's not about whether or not vaccines are safe. It's about whether we're allowed to talk about them. That's what's on the table right now. Facebook has the Oversight Board. There's a WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. I remember, several times I've tried to share things on Facebook and on Messenger. I'm not on Twitter, otherwise I've tried that too. Well, technically I am, I just never go on it. But I was shut down. I can't share the information I'm trying to share because it has been flagged as false information. However, the things that I was trying to share was just stuff like this. Their own documents is flagged as false information, but the documents that were being shared came from a source that they didn't validate. And it was a source that does not tout their narrative. And so they determined that that's not allowed. We can't have that. Technological solutions alone are not sufficient to prevent the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Efforts by only one or a few will allow false information to continue to spread and impact the management of public health emergency. Stakeholders include social media, news media organization, government, and under government, we've got a few different headings. Such measures include, so they're talking about measures that they need to implement, include task force to assess the misinformation and disinformation problem in national populations, implementing media literacy campaigns, developing fact-checking government-run websites, passing legislation, punishing perpetrators for spreading false information. Remember, false information is information that defies the narrative. It's not necessarily false. It's, in fact, most of the time, it's true. But you're not allowed to believe those things. So punishing those people, instituting national or international government or police-led surveillance of reported alleged misinformation or disinformation. So they're going to surveil you too. Hence why I had brought up the Patriot Act passed by the Bush administration and how that factors closely in with the decision to legalize propaganda, which both of these things should have raised a lot more eyebrows than they really did. National security organizations. The U.S. intelligence community, which includes the Central Intelligence Agency, NSA, FBI, DOS, DHS as members, recognizes misinformation as threats to national security, particularly when used in influence operations orchestrated in conjunction with cyber operations. So this is a national security issue. The spread of misinformation and disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic and other disease outbreaks has shown that, I don't need to read that. So what they're talking about, what a matter of national security is sharing information, again, that they don't approve of. A good example of that would be this. I have received information lately, and you have too if you're looking in the right places, because it's become pretty rampant recently, where a lot of people, unvaccinated people who are coming within close proximity to people who have been vaccinated, are getting sick. And a lot of research has come out that endorses the idea of viral shedding. So people that get this vaccination end up shedding the virus, so they can become contagious, basically. I know 2 people in my own personal life, they're not vaccinated. After they came in contact with a vaccinated person, got sick. One of them got sick a couple times after coming in contact with a vaccinated person. and I'm hearing this a lot. And one of them had some irregular bleeding. That's another thing that's been coming out a lot. People are having side effects that are directly related to their fertility. Now, those side effects, in conjunction with the fact that we've already gone through the, now if you haven't, go back to the earlier installments of the What's Going On videos that I put out there, where I go through the NSSM 200 documents. These are documents that are promoting depopulation and all of the billions of dollars that are going into it. They put a lot into that. They're highly invested in depopulation. Now we have this global program that's resulting in people developing fertility issues. I really want to believe that's a coincidence. I do, but so sharing that information that could potentially protect people is against the rules. That's what the CIA and the FBI and the NSA are going to be involved in. People who say, hey, be careful, here's an alternative perspective. Let's look at it from this angle because you might be endangering yourself. That's not allowed. In addition to the previously mentioned stakeholders, interventions should also be developed to better educate members of the public on how to evaluate their information consumption. Educational programs and advertising campaigns to improve the ability to responsibly review information for potential bias and limitations are critical. Educational programs and advertising campaigns, just doublespeak for propaganda. Priorities for a national strategy. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the need for a national strategy to combat health-related misinformation and disinformation. Policymakers should act now while the threat is clear and before conditions worsen to create such a strategy. This will require a broad approach organized by 4 principles or conceptual pillars. 1, intervene against false and damaging content as well as the sources propagating it, which means eradicate free speech. 2, promote and ensure the abundant presence and dissemination of factual information, which means disseminate propaganda. 3, increase the public's resilience to misinformation and disinformation, which means brainwash the public. 4, ensure a whole-of-nation response through multi-sector and multi-agency collaboration, meaning ensure there are no dissidents. We need to get everybody on board. This needs to be a comprehensive effort. Both the Worldwide Threat Assessment completed by Director of National Intelligence and the Homeland Threat Assessment completed by DHS have noted the threat of influence and disinformation campaigns, including in the context of COVID-19. So we're getting the Homeland Threat Assessment into it, the Director of National Intelligence. This is a big deal. The DOD, DOS, and intelligence agencies monitoring this information space should coordinate more closely with the press. What does that mean? Propaganda. Again, that's what this whole document is. It's how to disseminate propaganda, control information, take complete and total control, totalitarian control of the narrative. The national security response should also acknowledge the importance of homegrown health-related misinformation and disinformation. Similar to international sources, domestic sources of health disinformation should be flagged by social media and public reporting mechanisms, assessed for harms by health experts, and potentially deplatformed to mitigate the spread of false information. Assessed for harms, okay? Coordination between government and social media companies may be needed to monitor newly emerging platforms as they grow. Again, we need to monitor, closely monitor emerging platforms. Now, people have a strong thirst for the truth in this day and age because it's becoming increasingly rare. It is rather endangered. So when you have these platforms that start to tell the truth, they gain a lot of momentum and they gain a lot of attention. These government interventions are designed to slow that down. They know that people are thirsty for the truth, and they're going to take extra precautions to ensure that they don't hear it. Currently, there's a lack of consensus and understanding on how to best control infodemics while also respecting freedom of speech and avoiding abuses of power from authorities. Actions should aim to align with principles and guidance outlined by international stakeholders, including the United Nations and WHO. Why does that statement come right after talking about respecting free speech and avoiding abuses of power? Because the United Nations and WHO have nothing to do with free speech. They don't deal with the First Amendment. That's an American thing. So that's why they recommend, let's defer to them. Read between the lines. We need to circumvent free speech. They said in the beginning that that's free speech is the problem. So they have no intention to respect freedom of speech. Watch for those contradictions. For example, in response to the riots, this is a new section. This isn't in pertains to the reference to the free speech statement. In response to the riots in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms banned specific users who acted in ways that encouraged violence against and illegal activities. That's false. People were censored simply for basically saying that it's a good thing for people to exercise their freedom of speech. So I guess it does pertain to free speech in a way. These riots, now speaking of false information, these riots, these are the worst riots since, they're saying that this is the worst thing since Pearl Harbor. This is gaslighting beyond gaslighting that I've ever even heard of. The riots, the only person that died from the riot was Ashley Babbitt, who was shot in the face, and she was a Trump supporter. She was an unarmed woman, not in the face. She was shot through the neck and died there in front of everybody without warning. The guy who shot her, nobody knows his name. We all know Chauvin's name. We all know the names of these people who were killed while resisting arrest. We don't know the name of the murderer of the unarmed woman because she was a violent insurrectionist. An unarmed woman was a violent insurrectionist when the police stepped aside and welcomed a bunch of essentially protesters, not rioters. They weren't smashing things or throwing things except for a select few. Welcomed them into the Capitol building because they knew what they were doing ahead of time. They had this narrative to facilitate. They set a lot of them up, and there are people in prison simply for coming into the Capitol building because they were welcomed into it. They're like, oh, we're going in there now, okay. And now they're in prison. So the violent riots in Washington, D.C., it's interesting they referenced that. I can think of some riots that resulted in upwards of $2 billion in damage and riots that are still continuing today, and violence and people who are literally dying on the streets. An actual, you could say, epidemic of riots and violence, politically motivated violence that is being fomented by these very government agencies that are telling you that they're going to protect you and keep you safe. However, that's not mentioned in here. That's not mentioned. So, moving along, investments in funding and staffing innovative and cutting-edge communication approaches in public health departments would be helpful in competing in a rapidly changing communication environment. This newly skilled workforce would have capabilities in big data analysis, information management, and public health. So they're talking about creating this mass contingent of information control agents. These investments should include policies that prioritize rapid communication, clearance chains to limit information voids that can be filled with false information. More public health officials and scientists who have public-facing positions may be called on to provide public comment, could benefit from annual or semi-annual training and tested and scientifically validated approaches to public health risk communication. Okay, so what they're talking about here, what's a communication void? Since we are at least ostensibly referring to what should be a novel virus, there's a lot that's unknown about it. So an information void would be something where here's our narrative, here, and here, we can't really say what's going on because we don't know. Well, that's dangerous because that provides a gap for disinformation to fill that. When there are people who can provide an explanation for those information gaps come in and they say, here's what might be happening. That's a danger because that's getting a small little element of a narrative that contradicts our own, and we can't have that. So what do we need to do? We can't allow information voids. They need to be filled. And so if we don't know the answer to something, we're going to come up with something regardless and put it in there. What they're talking about when they say people in public-facing positions need to be trained and in tested and scientifically validated approaches to public health risk communication, they need to be trained to lie, because they're talking about providing, filling these gaps and these information voids with information that is not necessarily valid, it's not proven, but they're going to say it like it is. Much like if you keep 6 feet between you and the next person, you're going to be limiting the spread. Not scientifically validated. But the people who tell you that have received training so that they can get that message out there in a way that is a little bit more believable to the public, because they've had training on how to communicate risks. That's what they're referencing. Rapidly available funding to establish advertising campaigns. What's an advertising campaign? That's propaganda. You're advertising a narrative. These can be skipped. And finally, ideological values, political affiliations, and other aspects of identity can play a substantial role in a person's exposure to information, as well as their willingness to believe or reject misinformation. A national strategy should outline avenues for the establishment of programs from a range of sources, including news media, schools, communities, and social media, to help improve public understanding of how to discern trustworthy information sources, detect hallmarks of disinformation, and find accurate resources. Again, this is a method to install an inherent bias, a bias that has been programmed into a person. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about helping people improve how to discern trustworthy information sources. Will tell you what to believe is another way to read that. Now, when they say ideological values and political affiliations, what do they mean there? They don't want to come right out and say it, although I don't know why they aren't, because they've done it already in different spheres of government. The big offenders, the people to watch for, are Christians and conservatives. The ideological values are Christian values. The political affiliations are conservative affiliations. These are those that question mainstream narratives, because traditionally they get their source of truth from a different foundation. A foundation that is not the state, that is not the government. They're the problem. That's who we have to watch for. You see this sentiment being fostered in the public right now. What's being declared as the biggest threat? White supremacy. That's the biggest threat in this nation right now. It's the real pandemic. That's the biggest threat we're facing. White supremacy. I can tell you that I don't think I've ever met a white supremacist in my life. I don't see white people beating the hell out of black people everywhere I go, or lynchings, or I don't see anyone saying white power or white pride or anything like that. I just don't see it. And I never have. Even back when I was getting in trouble and, drinking and doing drugs and things like that, there's where you'd think you'd run into like some skinheads. I'd see some people with some like big swastikas on their chest tattooed, things like that. Never once saw anything like that. Where is the white supremacy pandemic? I don't see it. Well, I suppose it would be an epidemic right now, because right now it's just in Western cultures. It's just in America. So they are establishing a precedent for tyranny. That's what this is. That pretty much wraps it up. There are other documents like this. This isn't really news to most people in the know, I guess. Anyone who's asleep to this is going to stay asleep to it. If you haven't recognized some of those things that I'm talking about already, then you probably don't have a hope of waking up to it. And people that are like, oh yeah, that's a problem, are already awake. So I acknowledge that there's some element of futility in putting that stuff out there. People already have their opinions. But really interesting to look at the extent of this document from the Johns Hopkins University, or the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, National Priorities to Combat Misinformation, How to Control the Public Belief. That will take us into some of the drills that have been run. Lockstep, SPARS, Crimson Contagion. I think I'll just do those chronologically. Really interesting to look at some of that stuff too, and the implications there. So that'll be next. That's all for now.